We can take a little bit more time and focus on things and not go too long. So we're going to this week we're really focusing on the Veneto area, and Dario and I were taught. Of course, Dario is from the Veneto originally, and his family is right in the middle of this area here, which is the hills of Valdobbiadene. Uh, very important wine growing area.
Alex, I was saying, I'm the little kid cutting the grape in your picture.
Oh, is that right?
No, 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 no.
Let's see. Oh yeah, I see Dario. Yeah, piccolo Dario. Qualche anno fa. Uh, we'll talk about that particular area. So here we are, the Veneto. Look at where it is, extreme northeast of Italy. You see the Adriatic Sea wraps around there. Friuli Venezia Giulia just to the east a bit, and then above that there's Austria. In this area, Trentino Alto Adige, Veneto, Friuli Venezia Giulia, was really considered the three Venices, the Tre Venezie, they called it. There was a big influence of the Habsburgs from Austria. They occupied the Veneto area for a while. That's where we think the Spritz might have come from, which is why many Venetians, many people from the Veneto don't even want to hear about the Spritz. But it's something that a lot of young people gravitate towards. But a very important wine growing area and culturally significant. Yes, this is really like a kind of a bridge between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And there's a lot of this kind of Byzantine aspects to the culture there. When it comes to wine growing, a very important region, very prolific. It produces a lot of wine, and many of them are very prestigious appellations, such as Soave. We've all heard of Soave, a wine that I think is really undergoing a fantastic renaissance right now. Valpolicella, another one of those wines that became almost cliched in the United States after the kind of rebirth after the Second World War, and wines from Italy started appearing in the United States market. Valpolicella, Soave, Chianti, Lambrusco. Many of them were kind of mediocre commercial products. Let's face it; those were the people who were really struggling to get their wineries going again, and get things, get the economy moving. And they were not really focused on quality. How could they be? They were just coming back out of a very, very difficult period that really stretched for most of the 20th century. And so some of these wines, like Chianti, like Soave, like Valpolicella, they almost became cliched names, and people made an association with them as kind of being, nice, fun, inexpensive, but not very good quality wines. And all that has changed. And Soave is an excellent example of that. We only have one Soave to talk about, but very important appellation. And then, of course, there is Prosecco. One could say now it's the most popular sparkling wine in the world, and based on its volume of sales. Let's be very clear: Prosecco is not a type of wine. It's really well, you could say it is a type of wine. It used to be a type of grape variety, but most importantly, it is a specific region, like Valpolicella or Soave is, or any other old world wine appellation is tied to its place of origin. So while for many people, Prosecco might seem like it's a generic sparkling wine from Italy or from anywhere, there are people who are making Prosecco in Australia and trying to make an argument for the fact that they could do that. A little bit controversial, but I think it's very clear that we all associate the wine Prosecco with with Italy, and it's really a specific place of Italy. The place has gotten a little bit bigger. We'll talk about that. But so very important from wines coming from here, and in ample quantities. You look at the size of the region, comparable to Piedmont, to Tuscany, Lombardia. on some of the other areas. So a big player. Here's what it looks like topographically, and these are all great, great maps to look at because it really gives you visually a lay of the land and what that means for grape growing specifically. So if you can see here, you see where very coastal. This is the Adriatic Sea. Here's Venice, which is talk about altitude at, you could say at sea level, but oftentimes it's actually literally below sea level, and it has been for centuries. Hundreds of islands, all kind of linked together by bridges and canals to create a very unusual, unique place. So that's very, very low. And you have this big valley spreading up here. This is really the Po. Here is the Po River that empties into the Adriatic Sea here, runs across the entire top of Italy, from Piedmont in the east to Veneto in the west, and then it empties into the sea. So you have a big plain area, and then you go up into the hills, and then after the hills you get the Dolomites, which are kind of the pre-Alps, and then you're in the Alps. Over on the left here, we have Lago di Garda, and the Piave River is another very important river in the area as well. Um, so this is sort of our layout here, and we'll see where the grape growing activity really takes place here. These are the provinces of the Veneto area, and most of the wine production happens in this area: Verona, Vicenza, and Treviso. Once you get into the hills and right up towards the mountains. And here's what it looks like in terms of wine growing regions. There are a lot of them. I mentioned some of the more important ones, some of the better known ones, Valpolicella, which also means Amarone, Soave, Prosecco. But guess what? There are many, many others that are also very interesting appellations. And Badolino is really making a big comeback. You can see it's right across the Adige River here from the Valpolicella area. Uh, and a very, very nice growing area. Same grape varieties as on the eastern side. We'll talk about those, but same grapes. Bardolino is made from mostly Corvina, which we'll take a look at. So and they just came up with three sort of superiore type subzones within that area. So it's very similar stylistically to Valpolicella, but it's right next to this lake, which has a big moderating influence on the area, the Valpolicella too, but specifically Garda, because it's right there. And so it makes a Valpolicella that is much finer. It's very Mediterranean. It feels Mediterranean there, even though it's very high up in the north. The lake has a moderating influence, and you see a lot of palm trees surrounding it. So a very different wine growing area just over there. But we're really going to be paying most of our attention to these two areas here. The one on the left side is Valpolicella, and then just to the right of that, the yellow area, Soave, and also Prosecco up towards the north. So we're going to start with Valpolicella. This is the Valpolicella growing area, the greater growing area. This is a very, very old appellation. There's been wine growing activity here for thousands of years, literally. When the ancient Romans expanded their empire from central Italy and Lazio, they got, as I mentioned, they got all the way up to the north. They got all the way down to the south, met the Etruscans and the Greek settlers there, and then expanded their empire outwards. But when they came up here, they wanted to really secure the Italian peninsula, and they made settlements and fortifications up in the north to kind of block any invaders from coming in, which they managed to do until the empire collapsed. When they first got to this area, they looked around and they said, "Hey, Valpolicella." They spoke Latin, of course. They were the Latini tribe, so They spoke Latin. Val Policella means the valley of many cellars. So there, but even when they got there, when they first came up to this area, they already found many wine cellars and many vineyards going on. So they already had a healthy wine growing activity there. Um, as I mentioned, Valpolicella was one of those group of Italian wines that really made a big splash in many international markets, including the United States, of course, becoming almost kind of a cliched thing for many people, which now maybe works a little bit against them because Valpolicella, like and Suave, like Chianti, have really changed dramatically from those early commercial wines that were in the marketplace. They're really reflecting a particular terroir and this ancient wine producing history. But so an old wine growing area. Now we talked about in Tuscany last time. We talked about Chianti Classico. What does that mean? That is considered to be the original birthplace of Chianti. That's where it started. That is where the area wasn't born in 1716, but it was delineated, registered, officialized, and protected in 1716. 300 years ago. So it was going on long before that. The activity that was just when became officialized. So we have a similar type of thing here, and we see that in many areas of Italy, the Classico area. Here they call it Valpolicella Classica on the map. But when we're talking about the wine, there's a category of Valpolicella called Valpolicella Classico, which is a Valpolicella made from grapes, all of which come from the classic area, which is that one in the upper left there. Then there's another area that is pretty close to that area, Valpatena, that has been around for a long time and was identified and as being kind of another viable wine growing area for Valpolicella. And then there's the other area, which doesn't really have a name. It's kind of the expanded area. Here on this map, they call it Valpolicella Orientale, the eastern side. Although if you look at it, it all goes around to the western side too. It's that gray area. It's an added area. It's the expanded area. Once this wine, we said in like the mid to late 50s and then 60s, there was a commercial enterprise of producing this wine called Valpolicella, and people started to do it outside the official. Well, it wasn't even officialized. We're talking about the 1950s. And the appellation system really came into effect in 1963. So before that, everything was pretty much up in the air, fair game. And people were probably making a Valpolicella from this area for a long time anyway. So it was expanded. Once it got its official DOC, they tacked on this large area surrounding it where people were already making the wine. So people in the Classico area, they have to accept the expanded area. They don't really, but there's no official name for it at all. It's just the Valpolicella area that was sort of tacked on, expanded later. In fact, in Italian, the Italians call it Valpolicella allargata, enlarged, the enlarged part. That's so the people in the Classical part kind of look down on it a bit. But there's some nice areas there, and there are some excellent producers there as well. It's just not the classic area that really defined the wine. Okay, so here in this area, the chief protagonist is a grape called Corvina. This is really the key player there. Now, careful, because it's not like in Barolo or Barbaresco or Chianti Classico or Brunello. Well, Chianti Classico, no, Brunello, where those wines, Brunello, Barolo, Barbaresco, all require 100% of that grape variety. Corvina is a principal player, just like Sangiovese is in Chianti Classico. But you don't. It has to be a blend. There's always going to be a blend of other grape varieties, but nonetheless, Corvina is really the star player here. We'll talk about some of the other grape varieties, but peripherally, like there's another another grape that plays a big part in Valpolicella wines called Corvinone. People probably thought, oh, this is a type of Corvina that has like bigger berries. Corvinone means big Corvina. Um, they thought it was a Corvina, but guess what? Genetic mapping comes along and they analyze it, and guess it's a different grape variety. Um, but it is very complementary, and so they kind of tag team. They go hand in hand somewhat. Um, Other important grape varieties: Rondinella, Molinara, which used to be required, used to be obligatory. Some people thought it was kind of a second tier quality grape. So it's not required anymore. But for some producers, they really like it. They think it really adds a lot of special character to the wine. There's some others, Ossoletta, Dardinella, but this is really the key one. Now, there's another important thing that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at two types of Valpolicella. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but a few of them involve something like this. This is called a passimento, where the grapes are harvested a little bit earlier than the rest, very carefully selected. They usually like to pick out the kind of lateral bunches at the top of the cluster that get them the best exposure. They have to be very, very sound, healthy grapes. They're handled very carefully. And they're laid out on these wooden mats. They can also be hung up. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about Vinsanto in Tuscany. Here, they take this technique, this procedure to a whole different level, not just here in Valpolicella, but in the area of the Veneto overall. We'll see some of those. But so we're really going to be talking about, even though only two types of Valpolicella really apply for us, because there are two types in the Classico portfolio, but there are two basic types. We'll see that. We'll see what distinguishes them. But then there are actually 4 different types of Valpolicella. So here's the first one. Recioto della Valpolicella, and then you can get longer. Recioto della Valpolicella Classico Superiore. You can get longer than that. We'll see some long names. But this is really probably the first version of Valpolicella. It certainly was the first important version, and this involved this technique of a passimento. Here in the area of the Veneto, they call it recioto. Recioto, we think, comes from the Latin name for ear, reccia, because, like I said, they tend to really select the very best parts of the grapes, the grape clusters, these sort of lateral bunches right at the top that people kind of refer to as recce, ears. And they would use these for the recioto. And remember, they would always select the very best grapes for the very the most important, most prestigious wine, recioto. But they need something to drink too. We'll talk about that. But so they would make a selection of the very best clusters. They still do. Lay them out on mats, or you can hang them up. But typically they lay them out on wooden kind of grates. They're called gratici, and they spread them out in a single layer. They don't want to crush them, and put them in special rooms with these racks to hold the grates that are called frutai. And the frutai typically were up in the vineyards, in kind of hilly areas that had good breezes going. They had windows on all 4 sides, and they would open and close the windows to capture the favorable breezes. And that is and was certainly an art of its own. In fact, Sandro Boscheini of the Masi winery was really, when I was speaking with him, he was saying, here in Valpolicella, we don't just have one fermentation process. There's really 2. He really considered the appassimento a whole different fermentation. And it was like, you pick the grapes, you wait for just the right moment. But the drying was a whole different process. And this takes place over months, 3-4 months, during which the grapes lose a lot of their moisture, 30-40%. And then after that, they're fermented very slowly. Imagine with such a small amount of moisture and such a high amount of sugar, because you take out the moisture, it concentrates the grapes and the sweetness, the sugar that's in them, and then it's fermented. So the fermentation can be very tricky, to ferment a wine that has such a high level of concentration and sugar. Okay, so you make a selection of the very best grapes to use for recioto, which is going to take a long time and be very labor intensive, and probably be destined for the most important people, whoever they might be at the time. But in the meantime, you got to drink. You have to drink something too. I should before I get to that. Reasons for passimento. How did this come about? Why? Why would they go to all this trouble? They're losing a lot of the quantity, the potential quantity of the grapes by drying them out. But you have to remember, in olden times, sweet wines, sweet things in general were very highly praised. They were very sought after because they didn't have sugar. They didn't have sweeteners in all of their fruit. So if you could get something sweet, it was considered to be, wow, that's like manna from the gods. So they were very important. They were very highly regarded wines in general. Um, there's another thing, though. A lot of times, especially in these very northerly areas, it's hard to get sufficient ripening on the grape. It's cold, so they would pick the grapes, early, rather than just letting them hang on the vine, and then allow them to concentrate. So it was a way to naturally kind of concentrate the grapes and ripen them off the vine, because it was just getting too cold outside to do it anymore. Uh, and then, and finally, the wine that you make from a wine that is made from grapes that have been dried out, even just slightly dried out, maybe not dried out 30 to 40%, but by drying the grapes out, you make a wine that is more concentrated, it has more viscosity to it, more of a kind of a oily, syrupy quality. It's denser, and it has higher alcohol, which makes it a more stable wine. And one of the big challenges for people making wine early on was making a wine that was stable enough to last throughout the year until the next harvest. It was a big part of their diet. So this also helped make the wine more stable and durable over time. So here is another type of Valpolicella, and these are really kind of the two basic ones. So if you're not going to make a recioto with these selected grapes and this drying process and waiting a long time for vinification and all that, you make a Valpolicella from everything else, a wine to drink, a light, kind of usually light, fruit forward, medium light bodied red wine. And you would make it out of grapes you didn't use for the recioto. And this is maybe the grapes were not up to the same level of quality, but this is produced the wine that people would drink every day. So very, very important. There's something happened with this long practice, this technique of doing the recioto della Valpolicella. As I mentioned, the fermentation was very difficult. The transformation of the sugar into alcohol through fermentation, because there was so much sugar and so much kind of density and viscosity to the wine. So you wanted to have the fermentation take place, consume a lot of the sugar, but leave some there so it would still be a sweet wine. That was what they were seeking to do. But guess what? Sometimes, especially back in those days when you did not have stainless steel temperature controlled fermentation tanks, and you could not measure everything. Sometimes the fermentation just got carried away. The yeasts were a little bit too hungry and didn't want to stop. They just wanted to keep consuming the sugar in these grapes, grape juice, very concentrated. And the wine fermented completely dry with, of course, with some residual sugar. All wines have residual sugar. If they didn't have it, they would be very, very bitter and not pleasant. We're talking very low levels. So sometimes what was supposed to be a sweet recioto, passito wine, went all the way and fermented dry. And in fact, people would say, oh, scappa. We used to call it Valpolicella scappa. It escaped. right? It got away and got carried away. Uh, and then they also referred to it as Amarone because it was a big wine. It was like had the concentration and density of a pasito, but it was not sweet. It had a little bit of residual sugar. It had a lot of glycerin that you get from this whole drying process. But it was also dry, somewhat bitter at the finish, characteristically, like a bitter almond, which is one of the typical flavors of it. So they called it Amarone. At first, it was a mistake, just like winemaking, probably. But then, people aren't going to throw it away, so they drank it, and some people started to really like it. Um, and so they started doing it intentionally around the first part of the 20th century. And then we started to see the first commercial bottlings take place in well, I was going to say the 1950s. Actually, 1950 was really the first. Bola was one of them. Bertani was another. And I tasted a 1950 Bola Amarone in Verona. Amazing. It was it was not just drinkable. It was pleasant and intense in its own way. So fantastic wines. Then there's a fourth type, which is kind of a combination of these two basic types. So you take, and it's very simple. If you're a winemaker, you're working in the winery to make wine. Maybe it's not commercial activity. It's just you're making you have a small patch of grapes. You pick them. You're going to make wine. It's going to be part of your diet. Maybe you might be able to sell or trade a few bottles if it's really good. You might make a little racciotto for the signore that owns your land or something. So there they have the fermentation of the Amarone or the Racciotto is finishing up in December, January. They fermented the rest of the grapes, the Valpolicella, and they're sitting in a container somewhere, but it's a little bit light bodied. It didn't really ripen as much as they would like. The alcohol level was pretty low. Maybe the fermentation was a little bit weak. So they had a brilliant idea. They would rack the liquid off of the Racciotto or the Amarone, and they had all that stuff there. The pomace, the wine soaked pomace that had undergone fermentation very slow, 30 days perhaps. And they said, we have this Valpolicella wine that's kind of like a little weak, and we have this pomace that we're gonna have to clean out of the cask and throw away. But before we do that, why don't we just put the Valpolicella over the pomace? Good idea. What happens? So they did that. The Valpolicella, it was either fermented or in the later stages of fermentation, maybe needed a little boost or something like the Governo Toscano we mentioned last time. They would put the Valpolicella into the tank or the cask with the pomace of the Racciotto. And what would it do? It reinforced the Valpolicella wine, this intensity of these dried grapes that had been fermented. In many cases, it actually induced a second fermentation process in the container because they're putting this one wine. Maybe it still is not quite finished with the fermentation or just barely finished, but it still has some active yeast in it, and it hits the pomace with a high level of alcohol, and it just goes off and does the second fermentation, which really significantly changed. I would say improved the Valpolicella and gave it more color, more body, more complexity, more density, a little bit higher alcohol, maybe a higher degree or two of alcohol. So that is Valpolicella Ripasso. And without further ado, we're going to dive into a bunch of Valpolicella Ripassos and Amarone. That's what we have to look at. And there are quite a number of them. So we're doing kind of a side-by-side comparison here from a few different producers. Spaddy is the first. Old winery. they've kind of had some family disputes lately and divisione, separations, but it's an old winery, and they are one of a group of old wineries called the Amarone families. that are really sort of trying to establish a higher level of quality among their group and encourage other producers in the area to do it, much higher than the appellation indicates right now. And they're making some changes which they feel kind of goes against quality and typicity of what, at least what Amarone is. But anyway, so Spedi is an old winery now in their seventh generation. They're based in the very firmly in the Classico area. They have about 60 hectares, which is quite quite a good holding there. So they're Amarone, and I'm doing the Amarone first because in order to make a ripasso, you need the Amarone, and you need the Valpolicella, but we're not doing Valpolicella, so first the Amarone. Um, their their vineyards for this wine are located. This is a single vineyard wine, Santo Urbano. It's located in the area of Fumane, which is in the Classico zone, about 250 to 300 meters above sea level. And we're going to see this over and over. Corvina and Corvinone. Sometimes they just blend them together. You can do that in the appellation. They're almost interchangeable. So minimum 70% with 25% of Rondinella and a little bit of Molinara. They do a 100-day appassimento, losing about 40% of the grapes, followed by an aging regimen. It's essentially 4 years. 24 months in tonneau, which are 500-liter oak barrels, and 18 months in larger Slavonian oak casks, and then another year in bottle before it's released. 15% alcohol by volume, which is not uncommon at all. And I'll say it now, even though we're just beginning to talk about them. We talk about levels of alcohol, and now we're getting a lot higher levels because of global warming and addition, like ripeness and things like that. Before, the big struggle was to get enough potential alcohol in a wine to make it a wine and stable and balance the other characteristics. But the main thing about sweetness, or I'm sorry, we're talking about alcohol. The main thing about alcohol is the balance with these other factors. And Amarone, if it's made well, can support high levels of alcohol because the wine itself, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Amarone. If you're not, you should definitely taste it and try them and compare them. But a good Amarone can support the alcohol because it has incredible density and complexity and weight and viscosity and glycerin, and should also have enough acidity to support that. And then the alcohol is fine. You don't really notice it. It should not jump out at you, but it will have high alcohol levels. It has to, because of the concentration of the grapes. They do certainly a ripasso also from the Classico area. Superiore has to do with the amount of time that it ages. A similar blend. Corvina 70% with Rondinella, and then some other Molinara and some other native varieties mixed in. A little bit, since they're using the Valpolicella, of course, it comes from different areas within the Classico sub-area. And they perform this ripasso, repassing the Valpolicella over the Amarone pomace in early March. So, a fair amount of time has already elapsed. And then the ripasso after this, the repassage over the pomace spends about a year in large oak casks and 6 months in bottle. Villalta is sort of a second label of another old wine growing activity, Casa Girelli, that was founded in the 1800s. Since 1966, they've really been kind of expanding a bit. They've created different brands throughout different areas of Italy, but this is kind of their home turf, if you will. And they do also a single parcel Amarone called I Comunale, where they think it was a place where there was some commerce taking place. So similar blend, 60% Corvina, 30% Rondinella, and then some of the other grape varieties that are approved for the area. They have 9.5 hectares on this in this vineyard, which is a fairly steep south-facing slope in Fumane also. They do a selection of the particular grape clusters to use for the Amarone, and they lay them out on these grates that are called arredle in the Veneto, and let them dry out for about 45 days. Then they spend after that the wine for the Amarone spends about 2 years in large Slavonino casks and 3 months in bottle to have it settle. The ripasso takes place using a Valpolicella that has about 80% Corvina, 20% Rondinella. This one comes from a collection of different vineyard sites. Once again, has a shorter fermentation period, 8 to 10 days. Kept in stainless steel until January, and then they do the ripasso, which lasts for about 5 to 7 days. And part of the wine goes into used barriques for 10 to 12 months. And there you have it. Remofarina, they do a single vineyard Amarone called Montefante. Also, you can see the mix of grapes here. We have essentially 75% Corvina and Corvinone, 15% Rondinella, and then here are these two other interesting grape varieties, Tinderella and Ossoletta. Ossoletta is a very promising grape variety. It really makes a contribution. It has a very particular personality, and some people, like Sandro Boscaini, think it has a lot to show. And he makes a single vineyard, a single varietal bottling of Ossoletta, which I've tasted. It's excellent. I have a bottle. I'm hanging on to it for a while. But very, very promising grape variety. And we'll see a lot of other promising grape varieties that kind of get lost in the shadow of these other, the sort of key players. But so a nice mix of different native grape varieties to the area. This comes from the area of Castorotto in the Classico area, which is an area that has a lot of volcanic soil in it, along with limestone and gravel. They do about 5 years of aging overall. Now, this is a Reserva, so it requires even longer aging than a regular Amarone. So 2 months in large cask, 2 months in small barrel, and a year in bottle, about 5.5 alcohol. Then their Valpolicella uses pretty much the same mix of grapes. Would be a very interesting Valpolicella to check out for that reason. What role, even in very small quantities, do these other grape varieties, Ossoletta, Molinara, impact? What kind of impact do they have on the wine that some of the other wines don't have? What kind of characters can you detect with 10% or 5% of a grape variety? What difference does it make? But still, 65% Corvina, Corvinone overall. Once again, in the springtime, the Valpolicella is repassed over the leaves of the Amarone and spends time in large Slavonian oak barrels and sometime in bottle. They don't really specify exactly how much. Also from a similar volcanic calcareous soil. And, obviously significantly lower level of alcohol, 13.5. Corte Armano is also kind of a second label of an old wine growing family in the area who established their winery in 1907, right in the Classico area near Marano in Valpolicella. They are the Campagnola family. And their Valpolicella consists of about 70% Corvina and Corvinone, with the balance to Rondinella. They do a long appassimento, 90 to 100 days, and then they actually specify what their normal maceration fermentation time is, 30 days, long, slow maceration on these dried out grapes. Their aging regimen is 24 months, about 60% of the wine in large oak casks and a smaller percentage in new barriques from the Allier forest. And then after the aging wood, about 6 months in bottle. They're Classico Superiore. Now remember, Classico, excuse me, must come from the Classico area, and Superiore refers to aging period. 10-day maceration, so quite shorter. Yeah, these are fresh grapes. Kept in stainless steel tanks until February when they perform the ripasso. Then it spends some time in about a year in large oak casks and then 6 months in bottle before being released. This is a very interesting producer, Cesari. Now this is Gerardo Cesari. There's another in Lombardia called Umberto Cesari. There are a lot of Cesaris around. But this Cesari, Gerardo, founded the winery in the Valpolicella area in 1936. It's now in its third generation. They have about 100 hectares, mostly located in the Classico area. And here we see kind of a lineup, starting with the Ripasso, Superiore. You can see the mix there, 75% Corvina, let's see, 5% Negrara, which is and Rosignola, two other approved grape varieties that play very small parts, but these are sort of typical native grapes to the area. Which is in January they do the ripasso for about 15 to 18 days. And it undergoes a second fermentation during the ripasso period, coming out at about 13.5 degrees of alcohol. Then they do the Classico Amarone del Valpolicella Classico. This is really interesting to see because here we see that the process is pretty much the same. They make a selection of the particular grape bunches from all of the different vineyard sites for the specific wines. They do a selection. The amount of appassimento time is pretty similar. What really changes here is the specific grape varieties that they're picking from these different sites, and then how they're aging them. That's really kind of what it all comes down to. And so you can see these variations of technique of selection. It's really about selection because the process is pretty much the same. So you see in the Il Bosco, it's a very small single vineyard wine. So you have the geographical specificity, and each specific vineyard has its own characteristics that somehow the grapes are able to absorb and somehow transform them into wine. We're very smart people now. We can do a lot of chemical analysis and science and this and that, but we still don't know how the grape actually does, the vine actually does that, how it sort of absorbs these different influences and translates them into the grapes. How do they do that? We don't know. But so here for this wine, it's 80% Corvina and 20% Rondinella, which is different than the basic Classico Amarone. And then the aging is 3 years overall, 2 years in French barriques and Slovenian casks, kind of a mix, and 1 year in bottle. And then the third one is a Reserva single vineyard from the Bosan vineyard. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I think it's excuse me, 5 hectares. And it's located in the Ilasi Valley. And here you can see the soil is very different than the other single vineyard bottling. This is alluvial soil, so deposits from rivers. And it has also tufo, which is a kind of volcanic soil that dust has been sort of compacted with some clay mixed in. So here, you have the same balance of grape varieties, but very different growing area and also different aging regimen. 5 years overall, 3 years in wood with 15 plus months in bottle, a little bit higher alcohol. So this is a really nice range of 3 Amarone della Valpolicella Classicos. Now we're going to move out of the Valpolicella area, but not not too far. It's that yellow area right there, adjacent to the Valpolicella area. So you have a very close synergy between the two zones, and also the producers. Many producers who make Soave make Valpolicella, Amarone, and also vice versa. And many of them also make Bardolino. Um, but so it has a lot of similarities. But in this area, the key player here is not Corvina, it's Garganega, a white grape. Um, Here they also make Arracciotto from Soave, as well as a sparkling wine. And some people, I've learned, I haven't tasted it, even make a sparkling Recioto di Soave. I mean, why? Why would you do that? I'm not sure. I'd love to try it. Maybe it's great. It's a very complex growing area. We'll take a look at that. Let's see. We have these different. Well, let me go back here a second. Yeah. So we have 3 different subzones in this area. It's pretty small on the map, but it's very complex and very differentiated. You have the Classico area here too, which is the sort of magenta one in the middle. That's where we think Soave was born and then spread out from there. The darker blue area, Colli Scalieri, is it's not Classico, but what really distinguishes this area is it's in the hills. Okay, so it's not Classico area, but it is up in the hills, and that is the distinguishing factor of this subzone, and it makes a difference. And then the rest of it is the Suave area. I don't know whether it was really enlarged or not, but it began in the Classico area and spread out from that. And then there is an important, I think, distinction between the Scalieri area, which you can see, it's all broken up into pieces. It's not contiguous, but these are the hilly areas and the non-hilly areas. So there's a big difference between them. And soil-wise, it's incredibly, incredibly complex. And most people, they think Suave, yeah, it's like a simple, cheap Italian wine that doesn't cost very much and goes good with your salami and pasta and stuff like that. Yeah, it does. But it can also be a really great spokesperson for a very complex terroir in a very ancient wine growing area. And that is what they're really starting to focus on now. Look at what, and they've just done what they call a zonation of the Suave area. They sent me one of these books, and the distinguishing factors of each of these individual areas. Now, here we have 4 areas, right? But guess what? In 2019, they instituted sub areas. Like when we were talking about Piemonte, we talked about MGAs, right? Menzione Geografiche Aggiuntive. Here they've done the same thing, but they can't call them Menzione Geografiche Aggiuntive. They have to call them Unità. Menzione Unità Grafiche Aggiuntive. Why? The Minister of Agriculture in Italy said you can't use the term menzione anymore. You have to use another word. So they used unità, a unity, a uniting characteristic of a particular area. So we have MGAs in some parts of Italy, and we have UGAs in the others, and some other things we'll look at like Contrade and other parts. We love Italy. I don't think the Italians like to be complicated just for the sake of it. Some maybe they do. I'm sure Dario knows. If you ever have to sign any contract, you have to sign a contract for everything. You're going to take a class at school. It's like a 20-page contract. They'd like to do that, but when it comes to wine, at least there's a reason behind it, because it's very, very complex. So in the area of Suave now, they have 33 ugas. 33 individual subzones. You could call them cru. And we will start to see those appearing on labels now. Then hopefully we'll start to be able to taste, distinguish Suave from different places. But so all that to say, it's a very complex wine growing area, and hopefully we'll start to understand and start to appreciate and taste that complexity a bit more. Here's Garganega, white grape variety, but almost like Pinot Grigio, true Pinot Grigio, or some other grapes. It has this kind of little tendency to have kind of red blush or tinge to it. And this is our Suave here in the Classico portfolio. So the producer here, Dalcero, this is one of their estates, Tenuta Corte Giacobbe, but this is belongs to the Dalcero family. It's a 4-acre estate. Well, they actually began with 4 acres in 1934. Now they have 40 hectares and estates in different areas in Suave, Valpolicella, and Cortona, Italy. Here, this Suave comes from the Ronca area, and this area really kind of straddles two ancient extinct volcanoes, Calvarina and Crocetta, and this is one of the things that really distinguishes the Suave area and the wines that come from within the sort of volcanic area of Suave. From those who don't, doesn't necessarily mean they're better or worse, and you don't see any volcanoes. It's just in the soil. The soil has much more volcanic material in it, like lava, basalt, and tough tufo. So 100% Garganica, all stainless steel fermentation. Some people, will do some wood on it. It can take it, but it doesn't need it. Some people just prefer to have the sort of freshness and straightforwardness, like many people do with Aranés, for example. They do 3-month fining on the fine lees in stainless steel. So the wine sits in a large stainless steel tank, neutral, for 3 months on the fine lees, and they're stirred up on a weekly basis. That's bâtonnage. The French term bâton is a stick. So they can. I mean, nowadays they have machines that can do it, but people would go into a barrel, a barrique, open up the little long hole on top, and with a stick stir it around while usually their Chardonnay and Burgundy was maturing. It wasn't aging; it was maturing with the fine lees. 12.5 alcohol by volume. Very fresh, clean, mineral, citrus generally flavors. So great. These are really great wines that deserve to be better, higher value, given higher value, and better appreciated. Okay, moving to our other main area here. Prosecco. Okay, Prosecco. What does that really mean? We'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want to get into it too much. But this is, this is an area of Valdobbiadene. That's one part of the traditional ancient growing area. We'll see some others. Here, the key player is a grape variety called Glera. Used to be called Prosecco, but Prosecco would never really indicated only a grape variety. In fact, first of all, Prosecco meant a type of wine, could be still sparkling or fizzy, but it was a type of wine from a certain place, from the Prosecco area, wine growing area, made from Prosecco grapes. Well, what is it? What was it? Some people say, oh, you can make Prosecco anywhere because that's the name of a grape variety. It's not a growing area. Well, not really true, because Prosecco never referred to one specific grape variety, never. There are at least 5 different types of Prosecco that are grown in the area: Prosecco Tondo, Prosecco Lungo, Prosecco Nostrano, Prosecco Comune. That's what people didn't know. They just called them by different names, but they were always different grape varieties. And besides this grape, this was not the only grape used to make the wine from this wine growing area. There are 4 other native varieties that are permitted to be used to make it. Some of them are very, very important. Verdiso, Perea, Bianchetto Trevigiana. These are another type of wine that now they don't use the term anymore for grapes. Glera Lungo as opposed to Glera Tonda. So, and before phylloxera, they identified more than 37 white grape varieties in the area in the province of Treviso. I mean, I've studied this, so very complex. But this is the chief player. For better or worse, by law, Prosecco has to consist of at least 85% Glera. here is the original wine growing area. This should really be called Prosecco Classico because this is where it began. Did what you might call Prosecco wine or Prosecco grape, did it originate here? No, but where did grapes originate? I mean, no one really knows. Probably all in the Middle East. But this is where the wine that we know of as Prosecco was born, and this is where the culture of producing this wine from these different grape varieties took place. And it's an ancient wine growing area, at least a couple thousands of years old, back to the ancient uh, Ligurian tribes that were Ligurian and Veneti tribes that occupied this area. They were masters and mistresses of planting grapes in very difficult areas to plant grapes. And we'll see some of these areas were very difficult to plant, but they were up in the hills. It was safer up there. In the valley areas, they would plant vegetables. But so old wine growing area. This area of Cunigliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco DOCG consists of 15 villages, and they're all up in the hills. And that is what really defines the area. If you look over here, it's kind of a funny shape. There's a reason for that. But here, why would you cut a notch? Why wouldn't you just make it all Prosecco, Corigliano, Valdobbiadene, DOCG? Because this is where the hills stop. There's no hills here. It's flat. So that's part of a different area. And the reason that there's a good reason why this area here is much wider, because here there was a glacier that stretched all of it pulled a lot of the land down to the south, stretching it out. So the hills there tend to be a little bit lower and gentler, less dramatic than the other side, the Valdobbiadene side, which is much steeper. But the soil in Conigliano is, one could argue, is more complex because it has the morainic influence of all the stuff that got pulled down the hill by the glacier. So, and this, I don't want to get too excited about it, but this to me is one of the prototypical areas for the production of sparkling wines. But before you could even think about producing sparkling wines, of course, it happened by accident, but before you could even think about that, you got to be making wine. So it's one of the prototypical areas for making sparkling, fizzy, and still wines. And guess what? They're all still being made in this area, just like they're all still being made in the area of Champagne, another, we could say, prototypical area. I would say the other prototypical area of making sparkling wines, along with still wines and fizzy wines too. Okay, so we talked about that based on 85% glera. So let's look at three different Conigliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco wines. A little tricky there because we see there are two sides to the growing area. There are two towns also. There's a town of Conigliano, where a very famous, very old enology school is located, 1876. And then that's also where the Consorzio has their headquarters. And then on the other side of Valdobbiadene, that was the main kind of production area. There's a town called Valdobbiadene. So the eastern and western sides. The appellation, as of 2010, is called Conigliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore, DOCG. It's up to producers if they want to call it Valdobbiadene Prosecco, DOCG, or Conigliano Prosecco, DOCG, or use both names. Almost nobody uses Conigliano by itself, even producers who are in Conigliano, because it's not quite as well known, as, at least for them, as Valdobbiadene. But what they don't understand is that for people outside the area, no one can pronounce the names anyway, and most people don't know that they're towns or what their significance is or what kind of soil and importance they have. But nonetheless, so we have two from De Favari. One is and here really the difference between these wines has almost everything to do with the amount of residual sugar in the wine. So the Nera is it's a bottling. It's a brut. The bottle is a black bottle, so they call it Nera, and it has about 12 grams of residual sugar per liter, and that's how we measure it, by grams per liter. The other one is also a brut, about 9 grams of residual sugar. And this one, they also say that they also get their vineyards from Fara di Soligo, where Dario's parents live. Beautiful area, right in the heart of the Val d'Obiadene area, just outside the town. So the atmosphere you can see, 5.5 bar. That's how we kind of measure the pressure in the bottle. Prosecco generally has a little bit less than Champagne, 5 to 5.5 typically, whereas Champagne is usually about 6. So that's pretty common for Prosecco, 5.5. The other one is from, let me go back, sorry. I can't read it because my thing, oh, Canella, of course, I see it now. My sort of videos there, but so this one is from a company called Canella, another company founded right after World War II, when the area of the Veneto, certainly up in the area of outside of the town of Venice, was trying to get back on its feet and get things going once again, or go into extinction, which was close to happening in many cases, but it didn't. So this is an extra dry. Sorry for these typos. I couldn't see them on my small screen, but once you get them up on the big screen, extra dry is a different category. Brut is 0 to 12 grams per liter. Extra dry, you think it's going to be dry, but it's sweeter than Brut, 12 to 17 grams. And then what used to be the most popular style in the area, dry, which you think, oh, dry, it's going to be dry. No, it's sweet, 17 to 32 grams. So this one is an extra dry. It's going to have more residual sweetness to it, 17 grams per liter. This one has, and these are all a little bit. There's always wiggle room in between them, 1 gram or 2. Once again, the most important thing is not the measurable level of residual sugar. It is how the sugar balances all of the other components of the wine. And I can tell you, I've tasted wines, dry wines from Val d'Obiadene. So that dry, I mean, it could have 26, 28, 32 grams of residual sugar in the wine. But if it's well done and it's balancing a wine that has a lot of mineral component to it, like you get these, in Val d'Obiadene, very steep hillsides, very shallow soil, a lot of fossils and things like that, a lot of mineral characteristic. If you have a 28 grams of residual sugar in a wine like that, you don't feel sweetness. You feel roundness and creaminess on the palate, which kind of balances these really kind of pointed, almost sharp mineral characteristics. So it can work very well like that. So sweet is not always sweet. So those are the 3 DOCG wines. Now, over there, that little green spot there is the area that we just looked at, Cornigliano Valdobbiadene, DOCG, the original growing area of it with its 15 villages. In 2010, some major changes took place in the world of Prosecco. I say 2009-10 because these things passed legally in 2009 and took effect in 2010. So the original area of it used to be called Prosecco, Cornigliano Valdobbiadene, was elevated to a DOCG status, and they changed the name of the area from Prosecco to Cornigliano Valdobbiadene, Prosecco DOC Superiore. This is also when this change took place of the grape that they use, or grapes, they just refer to as Prosecco. They had a change in order to really protect the wine growing area. They had to change the name away from anything that could be related to a grape variety, and to use the name for the wine growing area. So they had to find another name for the grape, which was an old synonym, someone says, called Glera. So that's the name of the grape. Now, at the same time, all this other stuff was going on. They created an entirely new appellation surrounding, surrounding the original growing area, which is the green area in the middle there, called Prosecco DOC. And if you look at it on the map, let's take a look from that. to that. Okay, if you look at it on the map, it's much, much larger. It encompasses 3/4 of the region of the Veneto and the entire region of Friuli, which they also wanted to get in there because there happens to be a town in Friuli called Prosac that they were trying to make a case for the wine coming from there, but apparently it means a path through the forest or something. But everything helps, I guess. So a very, very large area. Most of the areas in flat plains and valleys, most of it is can be mechanized because it's flat. The yields are naturally much higher. The official maximum yields are much higher, but the amount of time it takes to work in the area is very, very small. So nothing wrong with that. But they're two very, very different growing areas. And there certainly is there's a need. There's a place for the DOC. Because a little area of Conegliano Valdobbiadene would never have been able to supply all of the great international demand. Just couldn't do it. So welcome, but it's important to know the difference and to distinguish the difference between these two very different areas. So here we have 3 Prosecco DOCs, all of them, and this is good. They're focused because these are all grown in the province of Treviso. There's a separate I don't know whether any of these wines use it or not, but you can have a separate subzone of Prosecco DOC that is Prosecco DOC Treviso. Or there's also a Prosecco DOC Friuli if all of the grapes come from that area. But so you see, most of them they're all 100% Glera, all 3 of them. Now look at the Le Contesse. I mean, just look at 40 meters above sea level compared to 300, 400 with a 35% gradient. Very, very different growing area. Not they don't spend too much time in the bottle there, but they're very nice, very balanced, nice bubbly wines. There's also a Pinot Noir. Actually, it's a Pinot Frizzante from Le Contesse, which is also made in the province of Treviso, and it's made from Pinot Noir and Pinot Bianco. Now, these are both grape varieties that are permitted in the growing area for the Spumante version of Prosecco. Even Prosecco DOCG, there are 4 international grape varieties that are permitted for it. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Bianco, and Pinot Grigio. So you can use them within the Prosecco appellation only for the Spumante version, and they were added as a corrective. But here they're making a rosé Frizzante. About 12 grams of residual sugar, which puts it right on the edge of a brut, the upper edge. And there we have that. Let's go into red wines. Now, there's a lot of still wines being produced in the area, even within the sparkling production areas. People before they were sparkling, they were still, and some of them still are. But these are some very interesting wines. Now, you look at Cesari, for example. We looked at a lot of their Valpolicella Ripasso and 3 different Amarones. Here, this is an EGT, Indicazione Geografica Tipica. And you can, with some of these IGT appellations, you can specify the grape variety. And this one is Corvina, 100% Corvina, dried out. It goes through a slight appassimento for about 20 days. And then it ferments for about 20 days. And then it's aged in small French barrels. Part of it. Part of it is aged in small French barrels, and then the rest is blended with wine in a large cask, where for about 6 months, and then 1 year in bottle. So this is a really great opportunity to taste this Corvina grape all on its own, and it's a great grape variety, even when it's not being used in this very sort of intensified way in a recioto. Isabella, excuse me, we don't want to make Isabella a man, so we'll say Isabella, not Isabello. This is a brand of own brand of Classico wines. It's comprised of 60% Merlot and 40% Corvina. Nice, a nice match, I would say. Which is fermented in stainless steel, and spends about 6 to 8 months in used barrels, which is important because then you don't get all those kind of tasty characteristics, not tasty, toasty, I meant to say, characteristics and vanilla and toast and things like that that come with new wood. So it's a little bit softer. It's more about the oxidation. And then 6 months in bottle. There's there's also another still wine here, Pinot Noir. It's an IGT from the Delle Venezie, interesting kind of relatively new appellation that encompasses the three Venices. Also vinified in stainless steel. You want the purity of the grape variety here. About 12.5 degrees alcohol, so very contained. And then from Italo Cesson, another Pinot Noir IGT, also 100%. These excuse me, these vineyards are all in the province of Treviso, and it's clay and alluvial soils mixed together. And they do something kind of fun here. They're not the only one that does this. They might have been one of the first. They tie a little piece of grapevine, of one of the canes, one of the grape canes, a tralcio it's called, a little piece of the grape the grape vine onto the bottle, onto the packaging of the bottle. White wines. There's also a white still wine from Italo Cesson. Also has the Tralcetto in it, in the packaging. This is 100% Pinot Grigio. From an area, and then interestingly, so the Cesson winery is in the Veneto, but these grapes come from Friuli in the, I believe it's in the Grave area, and it's gravelly soil, in fact, of alluvial origin. There's also a wine called Vivolo di Sasso, which is made by a company called Botter, which was established in 1928 in Piave, in the Verona area. 100% Pinot Grigio, another one from the Pinot Grigio delle Venezie, also 100% Pinot Grigio from a different soil, calcareous clay and sand. And finally, there is a Moscato, 100% Moscato Bianco. Very low, of course, it's a sweet wine, kind of similar to a Moscato from Piemonte, 5% alcohol by volume, and a little bit frizzante. So we have an off-dry and a little bit frizzante. And then finally, we finish up with two wines from Canella, aperitivi. This for them is a big deal. They, of course, the aperitivi has become, we call them cocktails, or aperitivi is the Italian term. And this is like an aperitivo. You go have an aperitivo before supper, usually around 7 o'clock. And now it's become an occasion for, mostly young people to go out and like wine bars and have aperitivi after aperitivi. And then many places serve snacks, in some cases, abundant snacks. They call it happy hour. But, sometimes, and they do this in Piemonte too, right? Aperitivi time. You go to a bar in Torino or something, and they have a huge display. And it's like, whoa, what's that? Yeah, you order that stuff? You say, no, you go take as much as you want. It's happy hour. Like you have in America. I say, we don't, in America, you might get, like 2 for $1 or $2 beer or something like that, but they don't give you all this food. So they call these aperitivi. And these are like, cocktails in a bottle. So one of them is a sort of Bellini version. They use their Prosecco, their brut Prosecco, about 75%, mixed with about 25% white peach juice and pulp. Some of the peaches, they say they grow themselves in the Veneto. Some others come from Romania, just next door. And they add a little bit of raspberry juice for color also. About 7 degrees alcohol, 6 grams of residual sugar. So not too sweet because you're using a brut Prosecco. And then for the mimosa, similar type of thing. They add 25% of uh, blood orange juice, essentially from Sicily. And they list the type of blood oranges they use: Moro, Tarocco. These are well-known varieties that are shipped throughout Italy from Tuscany, and Sanguinello. You can see Moro means like a Moor, kind of a darker color. Tarocco and Sanguinello is really the classic blood orange. So and that is their mimosa. So you can just twist it off and pour it into a cold glass over ice, and there you are. So that's it. Not too long. I got a little carried away with Prosecco, perhaps, but are there any questions?
Michael, I know you have a question.
Yeah, sorry, I was just wondering about the differences between, when we're talking about Amarone, the differences between the Superiore and the Reserva.
I don't think that the Superiore really only applies to Valpolicella. So there's an Amarone Classico Reserva, but I don't believe that, Dario, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that there's an Amarone Superiore. There's an Amarone Reserva.
Correct. Yeah, to my knowledge, the Superiore applies only to the Valpolicella.
Yeah.
It is defined by the different aging than the wine does.
And the Reserva category for Prosecco is really very comparable to the Reserva category for Brunello or Barolo. So it's an additional 2 years. So that's really a big commitment to that category.
Okay, I have one other question, so you can get back to Prosecco. I was reading recently that there are going to be approved rosé Proseccos. Is that?
They're coming out. It's already been approved. You can use up to 10% of Pinot Noir.
As a matter of fact, and we just received the samples from Saint Tomé. So as soon as possible that we can get together, we'll taste it. But yeah, finally the Prosecco Rosé is actually out.
Yeah, it was approved some time ago for the 2019 vintage.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate everything you're doing.
Very, very controversial, as you can imagine.
Alan, I have a couple questions.
Sure.
So, in my mind, because Corvina is the main grape and goes into Amarone, I was expecting a varietal that is actually a big varietal, okay? Instead, turns out to me that unless Corvina is a passita, it's actually a fairly lighter style grape.
Yeah, I mean it has a lot, in my experience of tasting them. It's soft, right? It has a lot of like rich kind of soft fruit to it. So it's got a softness, and it's fairly dark. It has a lot of the anthocyanins, so it's a pretty dark. It almost reminds me of like Grenache or something that's really kind of juicy and. But you're right, it doesn't have that much intensity to it. But I think that's where you can see in a Valpolicella that has a lot of Corvina in it. It has this pretty fruit character, not terribly dark necessarily, but it has really kind of nice fresh round fruit, sort of soft, and that's why they put molinata in it, is just sometimes to bulk up a little bit of the acidity and like kind of the tannin to sort of articulate that. But I think you're absolutely right, Dario. But I think that's why it's so informative to taste that grape variety, because you really understand two things. First, the selection of grapes from the cluster, but then even more the appassimento. What does that do? What does that do? I mean, it takes this sort of fresh, friendly, fruit-forward grape, and it turns it into this like muscular, intensely alcoholic wine with a lot of different dimension and structure to it and depth, and that's the Passamento. That is where you really start to understand what the impact of that is.
Thank you. And second question. So this today, for the first time, I heard about the Scagliori, the Suave Scagliori.
Scaglieri.
Scaglieri, sorry, Scaglieri, yeah. So in my mind, for me, I always saw the Classico as the best area for the Soave, especially, there is a couple of like Mount Faustino,
Yeah.
vineyard. That's, what I got to taste, I never got to taste something from Scaglieri. So I wanted to hear your opinion compared to the Classico. What can you expect from a Scaglieri Soave?
I think you can expect, and you should actually. I think you deserve to find a little bit more complexity, because they made that distinction there on the map, because some people were saying, hey, you know what, our growing area might not be in the Classico area, but look, it's a great wine growing area for Garganega. It's up in the hills. We have this particular kind of terroir, and so they really advocated for that. Okay, so then you got it. Let's see it. What is it? And you should be able to find in those wines more character and complexity that comes from a more interesting, more kind of dynamic growing area. And that, to me, that you see the same thing in Cornigliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco compared to the DOC. You should taste that. You should be able to taste that, because that is the distinction. So if it's going to be up in the hills, you should have a little bit more character and a little bit more complexity and personality that comes from a more complex growing area. And often you do. What is it? But at the end of the day, what does it mean? So they made this subzone, this indication of areas within the greater Suave area outside the Classico area that are up in the hills. So they should have a little bit more character and complexity to them. And then it's up for each producer to use that that site to the best they can and make a wine from it that has a little bit something more than you would find in a flat area. And so everybody should have. It comes down to each producer to articulate that in their wines.
Right. So, but then Scaglieri and because Classico again to me was the hillside, right? Or Soave, or not necessarily.
No, it's not. It is all hilly. It is. But it's sort of, it was really defined based on tradition, like historical production area, where I'm not sure exactly what defines that for them, but that was the area that was really defined as sort of like the classic area of production, which I mean it's all up in the hills. So the Scaglieri is not within this what was considered to be the classical area of the birthplace of the wine, but it's in hillsides, so it still has something going for it.
Okay,
I think that's really the distinction. But you could say the same thing about any classical area. Okay, it comes from the classical area. In this case, when you're talking about Suave, we saw on that map with the different soil types, it's a very complex area. And besides the different soil makeups, you have the topography, which is, and I was talking with some people there about breezes, how the breezes actually create their own terroir on different hillsides. So, it's a very complex area. But the onus is on every producer to reflect that in their wines. Otherwise, it just gets complicated. And we have some wines that have these really, really long names. I mean, there could be a single vineyard site within, and we didn't talk about it, but in Cornigliano Valdobbiadene, now they also added in 2010 this category called Rive. There are 43 sub areas within the area Conolino Barbiadene that are called Rive. So, okay, great. What does that mean? How can you taste that in the wine? That's the big challenge.
Got it. And one thing that I couldn't write down, it's unità geografica
Aggiuntive.
aggiuntiva. Okay, aggiuntive. Thank you.
I mean, it does, it doesn't sound, it's like a uga, right? But the important thing is they're very defined areas that that they're going to try to make a case, produce distinctly different wines with distinctly different characteristics, different takes on Garganega and on Soave.
Thank you, Alan. You guys have any other question? No, we're good. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to apologize to Joyce, Scott, and David because I guess I sent out a different link from what Frank had. My apologies. We have recorded the class as we do every week, so you will be getting that. And what happened is, as you guys know, Frank right now is in Italy because of his parents' health, so that's why the little bit of miscommunication. But we'll take care of that for the next one, and we won't have this problem anymore. Joyce, I did look for your Fiano, okay? Unfortunately, I have found no retailer here in Phoenix or Tucson that carries it. So
I found one.
Oh, you did? Oh, fantastic. Good.
At Carvel's. And I was just worried about missing the first 20 minutes because I was worried about the test at the end of the program.
Today?
But yeah.
There's not going to be a test?
Yeah, we will. We will set up. But again, thank you again for everybody for participating. Thank you again, Alan. Always a pleasure to have you. And so what we're going to do next Saturday?
I don't know. I forgot. I think we're gonna go south. It's a mix of regions. I'm pretty sure it'll include Campania and a number of others, and then I think Sicily and some other groupings will be the last one.
Okay, perfecto. We'll see you guys all on next Saturday. Thank you again for participating, and thank you again, Alan. We'll be in touch.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye. Ciao maestro, buona giornata.